The Brits have donated two Sandown class mine hunters to Ukraine, which is fantastic. There'll be undoubtedly a great deal of use. But how do you get them to Ukraine?
Definitely put a foot forward. You know, he smells blood. And he's basically saying that Zelensky is isolated in Ukraine and the time has come to have a conversation.
So welcome to Red Matrix, episode 8. Very interesting reflections this week. I think the main thing we're looking at with Ukraine is fast approaching the year's end, but it's not looking great for President Zelensky, both internationally and even internally. He's embattled at the moment. And then we look at Israel this week. The United Nations, both the United Nations Security Council, but also the General Assembly, all increasingly vociferous in their condemnation of what's going on in Gaza, yet America is still backing them. When's it going to stop?
Grant Shapps, who's the UK Defence Secretary, has announced some sort of maritime convention allegiance with some other countries. There's this bit of grandstanding. Is it real? Can it work?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to be invited along to this maritime capability announcement held in Admiralty House this week. A lot of fanfare. Grant Shapps had the Norwegian counterpart with him and also a member of the Ukrainian Navy announcing this initiative that should eventually have about 20 partners, all designed to help rebuild Ukraine's Navy at the end of the war. But of course, when you actually scratch away at the detail of this, what it was looking for example, the Brits have donated two Sandown class mine hunters to Ukraine, which is fantastic. There'll be undoubtedly a great deal of use. But how do you get them to Ukraine? They've got to actually get into the Black Sea. And the only way to do that is via the Bosphorus Straits. And the Montreux arrangement allows Turkey to stop military traffic going backwards and forwards when they're at war. So at the moment, no Russian military vessels can go in and out, neither can any Ukrainian vessels. So in practical terms, this initiative is much more focused in the future. There's no doubt if Ukraine doesn't have a navy at the moment, by training some of its sailors and keep them current on ships, international ships, that means that when they do get ships, they can jump straight back on them and they've got themselves a capability. But Ukraine needs help today. That's where the urgent need is. And it's actually very difficult to see how this will help. And it's got a bit of deja vu about it, because you remember the F-16 conversation that the West was trying to give F-16s to Ukraine. And again, there was a sense of, will they be able to help this part of the war? The answer was no. They're going to be when Ukraine has to have its own military capability at the end of the war. If you're going to have F-16s, the longest pole in the tent is training the pilots. So get started with that now so that when the war is over, you have a military capability. So although it felt with some of the rhetoric that this was about helping Ukraine today, the harsh reality is it's not. It's about helping Ukraine tomorrow, and yet the urgent need for Ukraine is today.
And is it? Do you think it will turn into help, or is it what politicians are really good at, posturing?
I think there's a really positive story about rebuilding Ukraine in the longer term. We spoke a little bit about the costs last week, but if you look at it as an opportunity, the Ukrainian military was largely based on former Soviet Union kit, which has proven to be pretty ineffective. What Ukraine has benefited from is a whole load of Western kit. It is it going to equip its future forces with former Soviet Union kit, or is it going to do it with Western kit? And it's pretty obvious it's going to be Western kit. That creates a financial attraction for the West, and therefore politically that's very attractive as well. So I do think it's something that will deliver, because I think it's not only a magnanimous effort, it's also linked bluntly to commercial interests downstream.
So these are troubling times. Things are starting to look a little bit bad for Ukraine, especially Zelensky, and it appears to have problems externally, which we'll discuss now, and also problems internally as well, which we'll come on to in a moment. Sean?
I think the tide seems to be moving a little bit against Zelensky at the moment. Some of it's just timing. The Israel conflict the weather vane in the media has swung that way. But this week, President Zelensky's been in the US trying to secure that funding. The US is blocking it at the moment. They've got about 2 weeks of funding left. But even if that funding comes about, and it's still a big if, it's pretty obvious that from a West perspective, Russia is no longer the threat to Europe it once was. Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, so there's no obligation to help Ukraine. Even with all the support that the West could provide, Ukraine hasn't moved the front line significantly. And there is an argument now that if we give more weapons, more financial support, how many more people are going to die? What's going to change? Nobody wants to see the front lines static, because if they're going to stay static, you might as well agree a peace. And actually, the West's attention can then shift to how do you provide a security environment for that post-peace time, and how do you rebuild your country? And those are conversations, I think, that the West is already involved in. That's why I say things like the maritime capability, the F-16s, the funding arrangement, the West now becoming increasingly concerned about, is this the time to start negotiating with Russia, even though it's horrendous that any compromise would appear to offer Putin land and therefore a degree of success. But bluntly, Ukraine is the minnow here. It's done really well, heroically well, but the West's support doesn't seem to be a blank check. And inevitably, the weapons aren't available on the shelf. We're all facing a cost of living crisis. There's American presidential elections next year. All of that is starting to make it look a little bit more difficult for Zelensky. And that's just the external pressures.
And what you don't want to do is negotiate a peace from a position of weakness.
No, and I think that's where probably Valery Zelensky, the head of the armed forces in Ukraine, has probably said, look, we can still present Russia a threat. We're still on the front foot in certain parts of the front. And therefore, what would a compromise look like? And I think there probably would be a deal to be done. But it's very difficult for Zelensky, who's put his peg in the sand that I am going to liberate the whole country. How does he sell that to the nation? Very difficult.
Tough.
So President Zelensky is under immense pressure on the international stage. He's trying to keep Ukraine at the front of the media attention, and things are not going his way. But it's also, he's struggling a little bit on the domestic side as well. You've been looking at that. Tell us a bit more about the pressures that Zelensky's under at home.
Yeah, I think he's done pretty well internationally. Internally, it's politics, not war. And there's always people that, fancy having a go at some stage. There's at least 3 people who've sort of come out and said words which are in some way opposition to what Zelensky is trying to do. His top former advisor is basically saying you should be talking. We've already said that his commander-in-chief of his military, maybe in lighter tones, but there's been some disagreement there. And he's sort of saying the same thing. The time has come to talk. The new player in the midst of this potential fight is Klitschko, who many people would remember as a world heavyweight boxing champion. A tall, very good-looking guy, strong-looking. He's now decided to go out on the world stage. He was never really a friend of Zelensky's anyway. He supported the previous guy, didn't quite make it. And there's always been sort of rumblings. He's now definitely put a foot forward. He smells blood. And he's basically saying that Zelensky is isolated in Ukraine and the time has come to have a conversation. He has also said we shouldn't switch presidents while there's a war on. Now that sounds like a really nice thing to say, doesn't it? But the clue is when there's not a war, we need a new president. I think potentially there's at least one guy who wants to put his name forward, maybe more than one.
It's no great surprise though, is it really? War, there has been this sort of spring offensive. We're not 2-year point yet, but we're rushing towards the 2-year point. Ukrainians would have hoped for the spring offensive would have liberated terrain. It hasn't. They've lost a lot of people. It's quite normal that the society would turn around and say, one of the options is we just keep fighting until we've achieved our objectives. But there is a very valid point that says, are you ever actually going to be able to achieve your objectives? How many more lives have to be lost to pursue that? Because ultimately, Ukraine is the underdog. They are the minnow to Russia's Goliath. And thirdly, how will this end? And the danger is that if Ukraine weakens itself much that Russia breaks through Ukraine's lines, then Ukraine could lose a lot more territory than it has. It's a huge country. It hasn't got that many armed forces. Most of them are, very busy on the front line. And if Russia was to break through, that could be catastrophic for Ukraine. So there is an element here of a conversation to be had. And part of that is driven by belief. Part of it will be an objective conversation. How many troops we got left? How much money? Whatever. And some of it will be subjective. We just got to have the faith. We've got to believe. And I think and it has been a difficult year for Zelensky. Yeah. And also, to be fair, Valery Zaluzhny, his head of the military, was always a lot more cautious anyway. I think rumours are that he was keen that the spring offensive didn't start this year, that it didn't start till next year. He wanted to be better trained. He said, we're using brand new equipment, which we've never used before. We're doing a type of warfare that we've never done before. Surely we should do a bit of training on that before we get going. Whereas the pressure was on from President Zelensky just to get on with it. And whatever, there's going to be a lot of post-mortems on the decisions, but it doesn't surprise me. Just whether actually blood will flow or not, it's another matter.
Well, as you said earlier, Zelensky has already said a number of times, I'm not going to give in. And I think he realises if he negotiated, he's got to give up. He's got to cede some territory. That won't be good for him back home. Whereas the others know that if that does happen, then they've got a chance.
But even if it does happen, I love the idealism of liberating Crimea, liberating the Donbass. But, practically speaking, when you look at everything that Ukraine was given, the West really doesn't have that much more to give. And it still couldn't move the front lines. Russia is not going to give up Crimea without a massive fight. And actually taking Crimea, given the access to it, is phenomenally difficult, far more difficult than lots of open countryside with a relatively open front line. So if Ukraine isn't able to do it east of Zaporizhia and in the Donbass, Crimea is an order of magnitude more difficult. So I think there has to be an air of pragmatism. And it might well be that President Zelensky's already decided that actually the right answer is to negotiate, but he doesn't want to be doing it from a position of weakness. And if he starts it from a position that I'm forced to because we want to carry on fighting, but actually, and we think we can do it, but we're being forced to, that might not be quite the same weakness as actually we failed. Can we stop fighting now, please? So I suspect there's some really interesting dynamics behind the scene here.
I guess one really big, difficult question is, will Israel actually succumb to international pressure? What I hear from them, and words are easy, is they're just going to carry on until the bitter end. Coming from the rest of the world, including Joe Biden in America and the United Nations, they're heaping pressure for Israel to slow down, particularly because of the humanitarian crisis that's evolving.
It's really interesting what pressure can be brought to bear. I think in the last week we've seen the United Nations, so literally most recently, a far bigger majority of the United Nations voted for a ceasefire immediately. But tellingly, of the 190 odd countries in the United Nations, the vast majority have now voted in favour of a ceasefire. But that body can only make recommendations. It can't impose anything, so it exposes how toothless it is. Earlier on the week, the United Nations Security Council met, and America looked increasingly isolated because there are 15 members of that council, 10 that rotate regularly, 5 permanent members. Of the 5 permanent members, the UK abstained, and the US said, No, vetoed. The UN Security Council is the only body that has teeth. If they had decided to stop, they can impose a stop on the war. Now, that would be interesting to see how that would work. But America made very clear no. And why is America so out of step with the rest of the world with this? I think part of that is because the rest of the world is seeing the casualty figures. But America takes the view, look, if we stop the war now, Hamas is not destroyed. What was the point in the war so far? You've got to see it through. The flaw in that argument is, what does good look like? You know, until about a week ago, the Israelis claimed they killed 5,000 Hamas fighters. It's about 20% of the 15,000 that, 25,000 that they claim to have. So if you do the maths, extrapolate, they took 2 months to do 5,000. That would be 8 months to kill the rest of them. That means they've got another 8 months of fighting to go. 60% of the buildings in Gaza have now been damaged in some way. If you do, it's just horrendous numbers. If 15,000 lives have been lost, Palestinian lives, do the maths, that's another 60,000 that will lose their lives if Israel carries on. And it's very difficult to see. If you leave one Hamas fighter with a pistol, that is a military capability. You can destroy all the weapons, but Iran will be pretty keen still to sell weapons and get them into the hands of anybody who wants to use them. And we've still not seen any significant progress with the Israelis taking on the tunnel network. So I find it very difficult to understand from a military perspective how destroying Hamas is remotely possible, and even destroying their military capability, there will still endure some below the tunnel network. So,
yeah, I mean, I don't think you need to read between the lines to see that Israel actually at its core hasn't budged. I've not heard anything from Israel apart from, no, I'm sorry, we are fighting for our survival. And it's got nothing, in a way, it's got nothing to do with you because you're not at war. Nobody's threatening your country. They're actually deciding to take us out. Obviously, the big weapon that America's got is money. But politics in America is a funny thing at the moment, as you said earlier.
Yeah, and also I think we've got to be, it is interesting because I agree with you. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu's on a mission now. He said, right, I've meddled around with the symptoms of this too long in the past. I'm now going to solve the Hamas problem, and that means going in. But I still think from a military perspective, it is Hamas probably is the enemy, not necessarily the Palestinian people, but the Palestinian people are paying a huge price for Netanyahu's war against Hamas, and it won't wipe them out. And if you look at there was some horrible video footage this week of young kids who'd lost their parents, covered in dust, blood, and the like. If ever there was a way of creating a recruiting ground for future Hamas soldiers, that is it. You're not solving the problem. You're creating a bigger problem for the future. And that's where I struggle to understand how this strategy is going to solve the Hamas problem. Very difficult.
See, what Israel's saying in response to that is, yeah, it's all well and good you saying that, sitting in your armchair. As I said earlier, we are fighting for survival. And what happens when you have a war? Bad things happen. What are we meant to do? Just sit back and let it happen and be destroyed? So it feels like they've taken a very binary position. It's either war, all-out war, to the end, whatever you or anybody else says about, it's sort of indeterminate outcome. You can never actually kill off the enemy, or we sit there and do nothing. And we've chosen survival. It's hard to see that there is a place in the middle.
No, I think you're right. But I have what frustrates me is that social media abounds with this sort of thing. What else could we do but attack them? Really, are you really justifying 18,000 Palestinian lives lost, the devastation of a city, based on the fact that you want to take out Hamas, and you can't do it doing this? They will come back. Cast iron guarantee, they will come back. So is that really the best you can come up with? It isn't a binary choice of either do nothing or wage a war of national survival. There are lots of ingredients to this. There are a lot smarter people than I who failed to come up with the solution. But the ingredients of that solution are not an open prison where Gaza is, are not 50% unemployment for Gazans. It's not a deteriorating quality of life and a situation where people are evicted from their homes. There has to be something negotiated, and that's what at the moment certainly the Arab world and America seem to favour the two-state solution, some form of that, where both sides are able to find a degree of sanctuary, safety, and to live their lives, and ideally with some prosperity. So it isn't abject poverty again. I know that's difficult, but I have to believe that this argument of either we sit and do nothing or we go to war, that rather avoids the uncomfortable 80 years of history that's happened, which has led to the point we are now. And I haven't found anybody who believes that the military solution is going to solve this.